After the PS2 era, the Atelier series was at serious risk of discontinuation. While Atelier Iris and Manakemia were an attempt to reinvent the series, focusing more on the combat in particular, they didn't perform as well as the developer had hoped, and this was attributed to the idea that long-term fans had become alienated with the shift in approach. By the late 2000s, Gus decided to make significant changes in order to revitalise the series. Their next game would be one that returned to the series' roots, while also incorporating a fresh approach to storytelling and updated visuals reflective of the new hardware of the PS3. Their answer came in the birth of a new trilogy in summer 2009. And it all starts in Arland with Atelier Rorona, the Alchemist of Arland. And we're playing the DX versions, I think that's pretty important to note as well. Atelier Rorona takes place in the Kingdom of Arland, a land that has been built on the ruins of an old empire. This empire had control over machines, and a mysterious traveller shared knowledge of how to operate them with the kingdom. These machines allowed the land to prosper, and as thanks, the traveller was allowed to set up their own atelier in the city. This atelier has been passed down to the current day, where an apprentice alchemist, Rorona, works with her seemingly lazy master, Astrid. Eventually, an edict comes from the king to close the atelier for good in light of its lacking patronage. Rorona is left to complete assignments every 3 months for 3 years to allow it to continue operating. And that's your story. It's charmingly basic, as many of the earlier games are, but it's never to the game's detriment. Atelier games are more about the characters, and it's no different in Rorona. The apprentice alchemist herself is a bit clumsy, and a crybaby to boot, but she wears her heart on her sleeve. Ha! What a wimp. But naturally, there are also a bunch of other characters who join in on the fun. They have their own character-specific stories, and Rorona can hire them to help her on her gathering missions too. You'll quickly fall into a loop for this game in that Rorona will receive her task from the king, which generally requires the crafting of some item, and then you'll get stuck into traversing the gathering fields and bringing back the materials for alchemy itself. When you complete the task, you are judged based on the quality and number of items you submitted, and are given a max of 10 stars. These stars become one of the most important metrics in order to unlock the better endings. As for gathering, it's done in a fairly straightforward way. Rorona, along with her party, leaves the city and you make a choice to go to a particular zone. This zone itself will then be split into several mini areas, each with their own types of enemies and gathering nodes. What's great about them though is that you'll often bump into obstacles along the way, and you generally require a certain item to circumvent it. For example, airdrops can be used to dive into the lake, or bombs can be used to blow up a rock. It's a gradual sense of progression, and you're generally well received for getting to the end of a zone, either through precious ingots and cloth for equipment or finding new recipes themselves. Doing so will also contribute to optional assignments given to Rorona, which you can turn in for vouchers back at the castle. These zones will also see you get involved in the turn-based combat. Now the party fights to a max of 3 members, with 2 on the front line and Rorona fighting on the back line. Much like Atelier Series, the characters on the front can take the hit for Rorona if she gets targeted, but in exchange, Rorona herself is the only one who can use items, at least for the early stages. And generally, items are where you'll get the most success. They're just ludicrously powerful in this game if you get the right traits in them. Atelier is all about making the most broken items, and Rorona embraces that aspect to a T. Now when you finally do get back to the Atelier, the crafting system will look surprisingly basic at first. No node-based approach like Riser, no grid-based system like the Mysterious games, it's just pick your item, choose your materials, and watch the process play out. But to say it's not deep would be, well, just incorrect. The complexity of Rorona's system all comes down to planning your limited resources, but also in the combination of traits. Quality of items plays a key role in the makeup of this game, and to get the higher qualities, there's often a need to combine certain traits to get higher level versions of that same trait. So for example, if you combine quality level 1 and quality level 2, you get the handmade trait as a compounded version. On top of that, you have your various effects specific to the items themselves, so you also need to contend with using the right materials to unlock those effects. Later on, you'll also have the opportunity to sell your items to vendors so you can buy them back and save time too, and it all combines into a deceivingly deep yet addicting crafting system. Also, while alchemy can be used to progress the story by completing the main goal, Rorona will also receive requests from both the populace of the city and her friends too. These function as a method to not only gain more money, which is actually quite important in this game due to all the recipes you will have to purchase, but it also doubles as a method to increase the important metric of Rorona's popularity. The reason being is because the popularity gauge, just like the appraisals, is tied to the endings themselves. And there are a lot of them. There are 14 conclusions in this game, split between generic, character-specific, and special endings. Now, I got the standard ending on a blind playthrough, but after looking at some of the other requirements for, say, the special endings, they're no joke, and what makes it even more challenging is the time limit. As said at the start, Rorona has 3 years to complete 12 tasks to end the game, giving her roughly 3 months per task. If she fails any of them, the atelier closes and you get the bad ending. This structure equates to around 90 days to complete each mission. Nearly everything that Rorona does takes time. Travelling to gathering fields, making items, all of them will eat into that time limit. And I've made it clear before, I can't stand time limits in games. I've never been a fan of them, so I expected this to be the deal breaker for me. But in reality, it wasn't bad at all. Rorona gives you more than enough time to complete a task. In fact, many of them were done 10 days in just through natural progression. As a result of that, the experience became very chill, relaxing even, which is what I value most in this series. So it ended up being just what I was looking for. The only thing that really stood out to me as a negative, and I put that in quotation marks for this game, was that the OST wasn't as good as I hoped it would be, at least not for an Atelier game. But when that's the only real gripe that springs to mind, that's a good sign overall. Everything else in the game ranged from decent to great, though it does show its age here and there despite changes made for the DX version. We'll get into those when we start discussing the next game. I know it sounds weird, but bear with me. In all, I wouldn't say Rorona was the best Atelier game I've ever played, but it's a solid entry in the series. A great way to start the Arland games, and also a fairly decent place to start the series for any newcomer. Yeah, that was nice, but being holed up in a city for a whole game, I feel like now I need to stretch my legs, go on an adventure of some kind. Well, I can't do that, but Atelier Totori, the adventurer of Arland, certainly can. Released a year after Rorona in 2010, Atelier Totori takes on a pretty drastic turn from the first game, and you realise this immediately off the bat. In this adventure you start in Alanya village, a fishing hamlet on the outskirts of the Arland Republic, which has been newly formed since the first game. It's here where we meet Totori, an apprentice alchemist who lives with her older sister and vacant-minded father. Her mother, a famous adventurer, has been missing for several years. Adventurers themselves are a class of occupation created by the Republic of Arland who map out the unknown corners of the world. Totori aims to one day become an adventurer herself so she can find her long-lost mother. Now, when you eventually gain control, the game effectively pushes you into a tutorial phase before you get your adventuring license, where you're extremely limited in what you can do and where you can go. But it's within these opening couple of hours where you'll discover the differences between Rorona and Totori. Initially, and shockingly, it felt like a massive step down convenience-wise. There were so many quality of life aspects that were in Atelier Rorona that were just missing in Totori. Accessing your container is a pain, quest items must be on your person in order to hand them in, you can't check the effects of traits as you make items, and even basic elements like experience bars for levelling up are missing. There is a reason for this though, because even though Atelier Totori is the sequel to Rorona, it is effectively the oldest game in the quartet. That is because the DX version of Atelier Rorona was based on its remake, Atelier Rorona Plus, which added a bunch of conveniences to bring it up to modern standards of the time, which, at that point, was Escher and Logi, the second Dusk game. Totori DX, on the other hand, did not get the same treatment and was simply a port of the Vita version with some added content. As such, many of the conveniences afforded to Rorona were never carried over here, so initially it came as a bit of a shock trying to get used to the added clunk surrounding Totori's gameplay. On top of that, you'll also notice that the time aspect really kicks into gear for this game. Not only does travelling across the map and alchemy take up precious time, even gathering and combat do the same thing. At the start, gathering will take up half a day, while combat will take up 2 bars of a day, but it's not too difficult to know what you can do in these gathering fields with some quick math. If you gather one spot and then fight twice, you can leave before the end of the day to save yourself some time, and it's that aspect of planning that becomes extremely important during this adventure. I've got no shame in saying that Atelier Totori, thus far, is the hardest Atelier game I've played, and that's purely down to its time mechanic. It's surprisingly unforgiving in terms of unlocking certain events and meeting milestones that I had to restart the game not once, but twice. Here, look at this. It says I took 21 hours to finish this game, when in actuality, I easily spent double that amount of time due to the restarts and the save load scumming when I made mistakes, and oh boy, I made plenty of those. So by that commentary, you're probably thinking that I had a terrible time with it and I wanted it to be done. And I will be honest, for the first 2 hours or so, I did. And the most fun I was getting was pressing down on the D-pad and making Totori do this. But as the hours passed and I got more in tune with the game's offerings, it started to change ever so slightly at first until it eventually cascaded into a wave of pleasure. I promise that is not a euphemism. I am not pulling your widger here. Atelier Totori actually ended up being one of my favourite games in the series, at least in my top 4 alongside Ryza 2 and Sophie 2. It just seemed to hit a sweet spot. It had that perfect mix of alchemy and exploration by virtue of its main premise, which doesn't take too long to surface. Eventually, Totori journeys to Arland and becomes an adventurer, but her license will require renewal in 3 years. During that time, Totori must show she is worthy of being an adventurer or her license will be revoked. By earning license points and returning to Arland, she is able to rank up periodically, and this allows her to go to ever more dangerous areas as she gains experience. If she is able to meet these requirements, the game eventually stretches to 6 years come the end. Now the way Totori gains license points is through pretty much any action she does in the world. Combat, synthesis, exploration, everything feeds into the license. And when Totori ranks up, more areas will open up to her and her party, and this map is huge. When you think you've seen everything, it just surprises you with even more areas to explore. This is easily one of the best parts about the game. It really sells that moniker of the Adventurer of Arland. And naturally, as you find more dangerous areas, you'll find not only better ingredients and tougher enemies, but also the odd optional items that aid in the journey. One of the best things about Atelier Totori is that many of the items you find and make actively assist you throughout. The time constraints are tight, but they can be made less strenuous with the items you use. Gathering gloves will allow you to harvest 3 nodes instead of 2 before a day passes. Travelling shoes reduce the amount of time needed to get to spots on the map, and some of the side characters will even assist you by improving modes of transportation, if you have the right items on hand and if you've progressed their individual story enough, of course. And these character events in typical Atelier fashion are a key part of the game. As with Rorona, there are a bunch of endings with flags to set off and events to see. If you go through them correctly, you can get certain character endings, or even the true ending if you see them all, which I'll admit is a pain to get in this game, so I didn't bother with that one. You would need a guide or to have played through it at least a couple of times to have a chance. But Totori has a real strength in relation to its characters. Not only are the new additions fairly good in of themselves, but since this is a sequel, there are returning characters as well, and the events surrounding them are just as good. It was a massive strength of the Mysterious games as they continued, and it's no different for Arland either. Admittedly, some of the flags are quite obtuse to find, and I did have a weird bug where an optional event prevented me getting one for Mimi about halfway through the game, but they were mostly easy enough to obtain. Now generally, to trigger these events, you must build your relationships with these characters, and to do that you go on adventures. These partners will of course assist you in combat, which is pretty similar to Rorona, a turn-based system with Totori on the backline and 2 front row attackers who can block attacks aimed at the pro tag. As before, Totori is the only one who can use items, at least until a later point in the game. It's nothing special, but it gets the job done. That being said, despite the ease of the actual combat system, the fights can get pretty tough at points. Some of the optional bosses in particular kicked my arse more times than I care to admit. Even with the best equipment with high level traits, I was still struggling, so it pays to have good usable items in addition to that. Actually making the items though is simple, at least as far as Atelier games go. Just like Rorona, there is no gimmick to this crafting. Everything is done via the menus. If you have the right amount of ingredients, you can make the item. But naturally, there are items that loop into themselves as well. So for example, you can make sylph breaths and then just keep redoing them to get the higher level trait and up its quality. Carry that over until you get it onto a cloth or an ingot, and boom! You've got the stuff you need to make strong equipment. But Totori also brought in the awesome little chimps who assist you. You get a maximum of 5 of these during the game, many are optional, and they make life a whole lot easier in terms of gathering and alchemy. Sure, there's a bit of micromanagement in how you order them around, but that just adds to the fun. So Atelier Totori has strong fundamentals in nearly every area, good alchemy, great exploration, a decent sense of progression tied to the adventurer premise, a relatable cast of characters, and I'll also mention the OST, which I think is an overall improvement on Rorona 2. But what really allowed Totori to stand out to me is that it has a surprisingly good story. That's not a knock on Atelier as a series, but I just don't expect that from these games. They're intentionally low-key most of the time. So I was taken aback with what Totori had to offer. It's still character-focused, as many of these adventures are, mainly honed in on the growth of Totori herself, but some of the developments during this game were very well done and actually deserved. I've no doubt that one reason for the success of this story is Totori herself. She's yet another great protagonist, a bit clumsy and frail at first, but she's got that great sense of determination about her, despite her outwardly feeble appearance. And I couldn't help but cheer her on. Totori elevated this game to new heights, and she was easily my favourite protagonist of the Arland games. It's crazy really, as I often value the serenity and cozy vibes that the Atelier games permeate, but Totori, while it does have low-key moments here and there, is anything but that. It can be stressful at times, punishing even, but I found myself loving it in so many ways. Like I said at the start of this section, Totori just hit a sweet spot. It was the near-on perfect level of adventure and alchemy rolled into one package. You then add on the strong cast of characters, the humour, the improvements in music and its surprisingly decent story, and you get what is, for me, the best game in the Arland series. Atelier Totori is a fantastic sequel, and a game that I think encapsulates everything that the Atelier series excels at. It's always nice to map out a vast land, especially when it comes from such humble beginnings. But now, don your crowns, because in the next entry, we are royalty, in Atelier Meruru, the apprentice of Arland. By the third game, you would think that the luster of Arland would be wearing out, but that's far from the truth. And maybe one reason for that is we're effectively not in Arland for this one. Well, not for most of the game at least. In Atelier Meruru, I'm just going to call her Mel from now on, the setting is the far northwest of the Arland Republic in the Kingdom of Arles, a land that is about to be merged into the Republic. We play as Mel, the princess of the kingdom who is being taught alchemy by a familiar face, Totori. Mel wants to use alchemy as a method of helping her kingdom, and the game is based around developing the land and growing the population so that Arles can grow into a sort of mini-metropolis before joining with Arland. To do this, Mel will fulfill certain tasks given to her over a fairly lenient time frame of 5 years. And as such, the gameplay loop is sort of a mix between the previous 2 games, as you have a home base in the land of Arles itself where you will conduct alchemy, see character events and hand in requests, but then you'll leave the kingdom and venture out to far off reaches in order to cultivate the land nearby. And much like Totori, you can make certain items to aid in your adventure, like travelling shoes to lower the amount of days taken to get to a certain area, along with unlocking shortcuts back if you make it far enough. The The development of the kingdom is a great incentive to see the game through, as Mel is able to use development points earned through completing predetermined tasks to spend on buildings. These buildings not only increase the population, but also provide certain bonuses like lowering the cost of items that you'll so often need in order to buy and save time. It's a tangible payoff, as the kingdom will visibly grow as you complete construction projects. And the same holds true for the projects done outside the kingdom, as Mel will often have to bring particular items to the outskirts, which allows the land to be developed further. These developments not only grant more development points integral for rank ups, but also allow for better quality ingredients to be gathered, as well as some specific ingredients not obtainable elsewhere, so there's always the incentive to do them. But that's not the only way that points can be earned. Much like Atelier Totori, they can be earned through alchemy, using certain items in battle, or defeating some of the tougher enemies. The game rewards you early on for taking on ever longer journeys before returning, so you need to make sure you're prepared for each excursion. And because of this, I found the game quite difficult in the early stages, and I think the main culprit there is that, unlike in Totori, travelling across the land does not restore your health or mana, meaning you're far more dependent on items which are notably scarce in those early stages. It felt like a needless change overall, and even though it does return as a feature later on through the buildings you make, I would have preferred to have it like it was in Totori. However, while there were changes, anyone coming from Totori will see plenty of crossover too. Meruru plays very similarly to that game. For example, gathering will take up time, shown via a gauge on the top left of the screen, as do battles. The battles themselves are once again the turn-based affair. 2 on the front, Mel on the back, and you have the ability to block assaults aimed at the alchemist or assist in her attacks. Gust clearly went with that if it ain't broke, don't fix it approach, and I'm fine with that. As was I fine with the OST. Not just fine, extremely happy in fact. Totori's was decent, like let's get that out of the way first, but this one was just wow. Like, I had to double back a little to just reaffirm to myself that I was playing an Atelier game. Like, the OSTs are great most of the time in this franchise, but this was awesome for a completely different reason. I'm sure some people will listen to these tracks and think it doesn't fit the theme of Atelier as a series, but nah man, this stuff slaps. Anyway, while there are common factors with Totori, Meruru does also have similarity to Rorona DX2, especially in quality of life, which shouldn't be too surprising, as this game began that trend of convenience. The ability to see your traits, actual experience markers for leveling, and a more succinct menu to traverse over your materials, these were welcome and also very useful when trying to find a particular trait later on in the game. Much like Rorona, traits can also be compounded into one another to make stronger variants. This not only increases the potency of that trait, but also allows you to stack more traits on a single item. Again, it looks simple, but it's a lot deeper than it first appears, and I was engrossed in it, especially for weapons and armor crafting, which felt very rewarding overall. In some cases I had to even disassemble my newly crafted item just to get the ingot with all the traits on it, which would then go to wholesale, and thus I could easily buy it again whenever I needed. For all intents, the gameplay is great, yet again. That's pretty much a recurring theme in the Arland games, super enjoyable gameplay loop and addictive too. Now as for the story, it's not as strong as Totori's and instead reverts back to the low-key feeling of Rorona, which is fine, it's par for the course, but it does have some cool moments within it. Mel is a princess with an attitude to boot, looking to prove herself, but much like her predecessors, she's a likeable lead and also develops well over the course of the game. She's always putting herself in the firing line for the good of her kingdom, and she's more than happy to take responsibility for the tasks that have to be done, which is a laudable trait indeed. And since it is the third game in the series, there's a lot of returning characters on top of the new ones, and it gives you a game that is surprisingly grand in feeling, despite how contained it is most of the time. It excels in terms of world building at the very least. As a player, I already know what happened in those previous games, but it's interesting to take the perspective of Mel, who has only heard about these events in whispers. It's also great to see how those prior characters have developed during that time, how they act and conduct themselves based on those past events. And the game is more than happy to poke at those recurring jokes too, they always got a chuckle from me. Though I will say, if these games don't make you feel bad for Stirk, I don't know what will. It's not all positive though. I have one big issue with this entry, and I hate it when JRPGs do this because they're already long enough. It took me about 26 hours to finish, which isn't too long by this genre's standards, but that's still a fair chunk of time. However, to get the true ending, you have to do a New Game Plus run, as some events required for it are locked behind that wall. I didn't do that, I rarely play through any game twice, and when I do, it's only after a significant gap. While Meruru was a great game, I couldn't justify doing another run to get what amounted to a different CG scene at the end. That's what YouTube is for. Granted though, the New Game Plus run is easier since you can carry over the equipment on your characters along with development equipment too. So if you choose to do so, you will have an easier time of it. One more thing as well, I know PC ports of Atelier games are generally not the greatest, but this one is the worst I've seen thus far. Much like the other two ports, there are small issues with the menus where it will freeze in between transitions, which you can get used to. However, this is the only one out of all the Atelier games I've played, not just Arland, that has hard crashed twice. Plus, there was a particular late game boss that caused an issue too. When it hit 30% HP, the screen would go grey and I would get a gibberish error message as a result. Thankfully, I could close this error and the game would return to normal in spurts, so I could at least finish the fight. But yeah, not so good on that front. Despite those grievances though, I'm very satisfied with this game. Atelier Meruru maintained the high standard from Totori, and I can't lie, the time flew by while I played this game. 5 hours quickly turned to 10, which soon after became 20 before I knew it. It's another great Atelier game, and well worth the purchase. And that wraps us up quite nicely for the final DX game of the trilogy. But wait, there is still one more game to look at. It was a game that was effectively a revisit to the land of Arland, and a game that completed Quartet in Atelier Lulua, the scion of Arland. While the other games were spread a couple of years apart from each other, Atelier Lulua is a bit different and sees a notable time skip of several years. We join Lulua in the small town of Arkless on the outskirts of the Arland Republic, who also happens to be the daughter of Rorona, Arland's first protagonist, who has since become a legendary alchemist in her own right. Lulua lives for the time being along with the desire to one day emulate the achievements of her mother. Eventually, a book appears out of nowhere and clonks her on the head, a book that only she can read. This book, called Alchemy Riddle, gradually fills in line with Lulua's experiences in the world. This becomes the core part of the experience. Progression is tied exclusively to the book, which becomes a folded Deus Ex Machina. During each chapter, Lulua will find herself confronted with a problem, but being an apprentice alchemist herself, she doesn't have the expertise to deal with it. At that time of need, Alchemy Riddle will glow and offer a riddle to solve, and the riddle will be tied to particular clues which can relate to gathering a certain item, using certain abilities, or defeating a unique enemy. If Lulua finds those clues and subsequently solves the riddle, she is given the answer in the form of a recipe. If anything, it feels quite similar to the first Sophie game, a bit more focused on its story mind you, but the concept is similar to that entry, and is wholly a departure from the other Arland games. In fact, Atelier Lulua feels wholly unique from the other three titles, as many of its gameplay features have been modernised so to speak due to its later release date of 2019. Though in the case of Lulua herself, crybabies never change. What a wimp. Like mother, like daughter. Really, it was a fine balance that Lulua had to strike in order to feel like a current-gen Atelier title, while also tying back in some way to the previous games. And I think it achieves that. Lulua overall is akin to an epilogue for Arland, a chance to revisit many familiar locations, meet old characters, and answer the final mysteries surrounding the land. It carries over many stories of characters from previous games, and as a result, just like Meruru, it's again decent on the world building aspect. Arland just comes to life in this game. There's no doubt for me that one of the best things about Lulua is witnessing how older characters have grown and how the more vague mysteries of the past tie together. That being said, what about Lulua herself? Does she do enough to stand among the other three? I think so. She's certainly unique in many ways, and if anything, I'd say she's the comedy relief character, the clown. Lulua gets herself in so many stupid situations, and she often has the habit of doing jump cut transitions that give this air of light humour to her character. She's lively, a fan of the jazz hands, a bit unrestrained, and a curry nut to boot. There were some great scenes tied to Lulua and the unfortunate results that birthed from it.
何を隠そう賢者の石なんだから変わらないよ石でも賢者の石でもルルアちゃん食べる人の気持ちを考えてよ待って話を聞いてエヴァ賢者の石はね万能なんだよ
Even so, she's still a great protagonist. I've yet to see one pro tag who I haven't liked in this game so far, so it's almost a given now. The same holds true for many of the wider cast too, and their stories proceed in a similar vein to the other titles. You build up your relations with the other members, see events and eventually unlock their specific endings. If you manage to get them all, you get the true ending, which coincidentally was the only game of the 4 that I managed to get it on. And I think a big part as to how I was able to do that is because Atelier Lulua is just notably more relaxed. There is a clock in this game, but outside of events, a day-night cycle, and specific ingredients appearing at a certain time, it's pretty much just a decoration. From what I could see, there was no deadline tied to anything you do in this game. For all intents, you can do everything at your own pace, with only the most basic of planning needed to maximise on the aforementioned events and ingredients. Which is good, because Lulua really does ramp it up at other parts of the game, like its OST, which has some absolute bangers in there. I wouldn't say it's as good as Meruru's, but it's a close second. On the gameplay side of things, much like the other titles, gathering fields present one half of the experience, with standard items picked up off the ground, fishing, bug catching and so on. As is the core of an Atelier experience, you go to these fields, take out some enemies here and there, and bring the items back to home base. Now when you return, you'll find Lulua carries over plenty of the modernised features of later games, the likes of wholesale returns, but you also get event markers when fast travelling, and the ever helpful restocking is here to prevent the need of making new consumables. This liberty and freedom is also carried over to the combat, which also got a notable overhaul. While still a turn-based system, Lulua instead increases the party max to 5 instead of 3, with 3 on the front line and 2 on the back. The 3 members on the front line actively participate in battle, while the 2 on the back offer support abilities, much like what was seen in Lydian Suel. You will also receive certain bonuses for different combinations of characters, so it pays to think about how to set up the front line and how to position the backline members too. For example, Piana often triggers her support abilities off physical attacks, so you would want to place her behind 2 physically centric characters to maximise her effectiveness. On top of that, there are ultimate attacks unlocked later in the game, along with the extremely generous interrupt system. On the bottom right, up to 3 alchemists can use an assigned item when the gauge fills. When an enemy turn is about to begin its turn, for example, you hold the right bumper, press the corresponding button, and that character will jump in immediately to use said item. The crux of it though is that every item tied to the interrupt mechanic can be used infinitely, even when the count hits 0. So all you need to do is make that extremely powerful bomb once and you have it for perpetuity. It's an exceedingly liberal system overall, fun no doubt, but an interesting angle to go down. I don't actually know if that was intentional or not. Granted though, it seems that generosity was a mercy by the developers, as it does have some notable spikes in difficulty. Now this is no secret, Atelier games do have the odd difficulty spike later on as a sort of gear check to make sure you've understood the alchemy system, but even so I'd say this is the most notable I've seen thus far. Even the main story bosses can cause a bit of trouble if you're not keeping your gear up to snuff, and there's plenty to work with. You have weapons, armor, accessories, and symbols, each with their own set of traits contributing to the character's resultant power. Of course, the only way to circumvent a difficulty spike in an Atelier game is to get stuck into the alchemy. And I don't say this lightly. It's complex. It took me a little bit of time to get my head around. The alchemy system in Atelier Lulua is one of, if not the most complicated I've seen in the series yet. Much like most of the game, it also got an overhaul, likely as a method to build on the mysterious titles and their grid-based approach. Atelier Lulua operates with a blip-based system for effect levels split into 4 elements: ice, lightning, fire and earth. Each ingredient will also have those blips applied to them in certain levels. For example, using a pure oil can be used to give you 5 blips to an earth denominated effect. However, what you need to contend with is that the elements will often work against each other, sort of like a tug of war, which presents a challenge in of itself. And despite my praise of the quality of life features, it was a bit finicky to work with all the different menus. I also wasn't a fan of the idea that the traits you're accumulating on the items as you synthesize aren't shown in a comprehensive list like it was in some of the other titles. You only see them at the end of the process, which isn't too helpful as these traits often combine into the compounded versions too, much like Rorona and Meruru. However, that is not the only thing you're contending with, as Lulua also introduced awakened effects. Certain parts of a synthesis will allow for this, and each ingredient has its own unique property, like adding a certain class of ingredient to the finished item, or even adding stats. This is where the depth comes in. Getting the most out of Lulua's system requires a good understanding of not only the traits and effect levels, but also the awakened effects too. In many cases, you're using the awakened effect to move a max quality item to say a class of ingredient that will eventually allow it to be put onto an item you want, like a usable item, ingot or cloth. Finding the combination that works in line with this, while also still balancing the staples like effect level and combining traits, turns it into an involved system. And while I personally didn't find it the most satisfying in that I felt it was a bit too much, I mean just look at some of the late game guides, they're bonkers, I can't fault the ambition of its mechanic. Granted, I was able to understand it enough that the late game bosses never presented too much of a problem to me, and I imagine there will be others who could break it far more than I was able to. There's certainly a lot of experimenting to be had here. Overall, Lulua ended up as a very positive experience. Outside of its lack of polish on the localization, as I saw plenty of grammar and spelling errors during my time playing it, the majority of it was enjoyable. It was interesting really, as Lulua had to revisit a series from an older era while also bringing it up to a standard that fans had come to expect at that point, and it checked out many of the boxes. Revisiting the lands and characters of old was a joy, and I felt it was a solid way to end the Arland quartet. While I wouldn't say Lulua was my favourite of the 4, it definitely stands out in its own special way, and thus earns its own place within the collection. And that's what it all comes down to really. Gust created something that, by all intents, should have become dull by the 3rd game, but they always found a way to make something new and fresh. And yeah, I am looking forward to what their next mainline entry is going to be. I don't count that other one. But yeah, it's done. I guess my only goal now is to try and find that other premium edition when I go back to Japan this year. Wish me luck. I'm gonna need it. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace.